Welcome to another case with Nero Wolfe, the brilliant and reclusive detective, and his loyal assistant, Archie Goodwin. This time, the stakes are high and the secrets even higher as Wolfe delves into a tangled web of blackmail, ambition, and murder. With reputations on the line and lives shattered, the truth lies hidden behind a series of carefully constructed lies. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you now? As we uncover the past, ask yourself, how far would you go to protect your darkest secrets? It was just shy of 4 o'clock when the doorbell at the brownstone rang with an urgency usually reserved for fire alarms and hostile creditors. Fritz was bustling in the kitchen, so the duty fell to me. When I swung open the door, I found a tall, broad-shouldered man with dark hair, a tailored overcoat, and an expression that would have made a statue blink. "Good afternoon," he said curtly. "I'm Leonard V. Blackston. I must speak with Mr. Wolfe at once." Normally, anyone making demands on Mr. Wolfe's time without an engraved invitation would be enjoying the fresh air on the front steps within minutes. But Blackston's name was no small fry. Even I, allergic as I am to politics, recognized the man, a rising congressman with a reputation cleaner than a surgeon's scalpel. "You and 1,000 reporters," I said easily. "But come on in. You've caught us at our most vulnerable, awake." He stepped inside, shoulders stiff, casting a wary glance over his shoulder before I shut the door. There was a nervous tension humming off him, one I'd seen before in men who knew that fortune had turned its back and left them to face the wolves. Or in this case, Wolfe. As I led him toward the office, he muttered under his breath, "This cannot wait." By the time we crossed the threshold, Wolfe was already glowering at the disturbance, book in hand, lips compressed into a line that could have sliced marble. "I do not receive without appointment," Wolfe intoned, setting his book aside with deliberate care, as if the mere presence of Blackston offended the bindings. "My name is Leonard Blackston," the man said, with less bluster than I expected from someone used to being listened to. "I require your help. It is urgent. It is private." Wolfe's gaze sharpened. He loathed urgency, and privacy came at a steep price. Still, something in Blackstone's bearing, the barely controlled agitation, the air of a man who had spent too many sleepless nights, gave even Wolfe pause. "You require my help?" Wolfe repeated, as if tasting something sour. "I assume you understand that my acceptance of engagements is at my sole discretion." "I am prepared to compensate you generously," Blackston said quickly, "but I must insist on absolute confidentiality." Wolfe leaned back, fingers steepled under his chin. "Confidentiality is a burden I do not shoulder lightly. You will be candid, entirely candid, or you will leave." Blackston hesitated just long enough for Wolfe to raise an eyebrow. Then, with a nod, heavy with the weight of consequence, he said, "I agree." "Very well," Wolfe said. "Speak." I pulled out my notebook. Something told me I was going to need a lot of paper. Blackston's hands remained knotted tightly in his lap. His voice, when he spoke, was low and deliberate, the cadence of a man forcing order on panic. "I am being blackmailed," he said. "But not over anything I have personally done." Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "Elucidate." 10 years ago, before I entered public office, I invested in a parcel of riverfront property. It was purchased through a holding company. There is a silent partner involved. I was assured the deal was legal and above board. "And now," Wolfe prompted. "Now," Blackstone continued grimly, "someone has surfaced, claiming to have documentation tying me to that deal. They demand payment, a substantial payment, or they will make the information public." Wolfe's expression remained impassive. "I assume the documentation is authentic?" "I don't know," Blackstone said, a muscle twitching at his temple, "but the mere allegation would be ruinous." Archie's pen scratched across his pad. "I didn't have to be a genius to see it. A man like Blackston, who built his political brand on clean living and cleaner finances, couldn't afford even the scent of scandal." "You have not reported this to the authorities," Wolfe said. "No." Blackstone's jaw tightened. If I involve law enforcement, the mere investigation could destroy my career. Then you require discretion, Wolfe said dryly. And expedience. Blackstone nodded, his face lined with strain. Outside, somewhere on 35th Street, a car horn blared, a sharp reminder that the world outside was less forgiving than the one Wolfe curated inside these walls. I cannot, will not, yield to blackmail, Blackstone said, leaning forward, urgency sharpening his words. If they have the documents, let them come. I will not pay. Wolfe's brows rose a fraction. An admirable position, albeit perilous. It is not mere stubbornness, Blackstone insisted. If I pay once, there will be no end to it. I would rather face ruin on my terms than live under someone else's thumb. It wasn't just bravado, there was real conviction in his voice. I scribbled it down, noting the way he clenched and unclenched his fists, the subtle tremor at the edge of his words. This wasn't a man used to feeling powerless, and it was killing him. Wolfe tapped his fingertips together. Very well. You seek to uncover the identity of your adversary, neutralize the threat, and preserve your reputation. Exactly. And the silent partner? I have no wish to expose them unless necessary, Blackstone said tightly. Their involvement would complicate matters. Personally. That caught Wolfe's attention like a hook in a trout's jaw. He said nothing, but a flicker of interest crossed his face. Personal entanglements were rarely neat, and they often bled into the professional with messy, ruinous results. Wolfe closed his eyes briefly, as if weighing the irritation against the intellectual challenge. When he spoke, it was with crisp finality. Very well, Mr. Blackstone. I accept the engagement. Relief flooded Blackstone's face so quickly it almost betrayed him. Almost. He was a politician, after all. You will leave with Archie any and all materials relating to the matter, Wolfe continued. You will not discuss our involvement with any third party. You will remain available for summons at my discretion. Understood, Blackstone said, rising. I tucked my notebook away and followed him toward the door. As I reached for the latch, I caught a movement in the corner of my eye. Blackstone, not looking at me, but past me, through the narrow window that overlooked the street. He stiffened. His hand, just for a moment, hovered near the lapel of his coat, where instinct might drive a man to reach for a weapon he didn't have. I stepped aside casually, peeking through the glass. Nothing out of place, just the usual traffic, a man with a newspaper, a woman walking a dog. But Blackstone's jaw was clenched tight enough to crack teeth. You expecting company? I asked lightly. No, he said too quickly. Just cautious. Right, I drawled. In this town, who isn't? I opened the door and he slipped out, shoulders hunched against more than just the December cold. I watched him walk briskly down the steps, then along the sidewalk, glancing back once, twice, until he turned the corner and vanished. When I returned to the office, Wolfe was already reaching for another beer. His heavy-lidded gaze fixed on me. You saw it too, he said. Yeah, I said. He's scared, all right, and not just of losing an election. Finding dirt on a politician isn't usually my idea of an afternoon well spent, mainly because most of them come pre-dusted. But Blackstone was proving a tougher nut. His past, at first glance, was cleaner than a convent kitchen. Still, Wolfe had pointed me toward the land deal, and I aimed to dig until something cracked. By mid-morning, I was tucked into a corner at the Hall of Records, wrestling with microfilm reels and the general smell of government mildew. Persistence, like bad cologne, pays off eventually. In the ownership files, buried under layers of corporate shells thicker than Wolfe's beer belly, I found it. A decade-old transaction for a chunk of riverfront property, prime real estate now, but back then little more than scrubland and wishful thinking. The company name meant nothing, some alphabet soup of initials. But the signatures on the formation papers raised one familiar eyebrow. Leonard V. Blackstone, before he discovered a taste for patriotism, had signed as a founding member. I leaned back, whistling low. The property had quintupled in value over 10 years thanks to a series of conveniently timed rezoning moves. That wasn't just luck, that was orchestration. I made notes, pulled copies, and exited with the distinct feeling that the riverfront deal wasn't merely a youthful financial adventure. Blackstone hadn't been alone in it, and whoever else had been involved had made damn sure their name stayed off the books, which meant someone else still had cards to play. With the land angle nailed down, it was time to sniff around the neighborhood for rumors, the kind that don't make it into official transcripts but linger like cheap perfume. A couple of aging real estate brokers at a coffee shop downtown were happy to reminisce, especially after I waved a few greenbacks around. According to their collective memory, the riverfront property had been a sleepy backwater until an unexpected rezoning pushed its value through the roof. "Funny thing," one of them said, stirring his coffee so violently it sloshed over the rim. "Nobody saw that coming. One week it was wasteland, next week the papers said luxury development zone. And who," I asked with my best boyish charm, "would know that sort of thing ahead of time?" The man shrugged, but his partner chuckled. "Only someone with friends in city planning." That was the rub. Rezoning scandals had peppered the city's history, but this one had been small enough, quiet enough, that no smoking gun had ever been found. Small, quiet, and perfect for blackmail. I finished my coffee, left a generous tip, and exited into the street, my mind turning over possibilities. Rezoning, silent partners, and Blackstone's clean image were starting to look incompatible. By noon, I was back at the brownstone, my notes a chaotic mess of leads, half-leads, and tantalizing blanks. I spread the material across Wolfe's desk while he devoured a plate of squab in silence. When I finished my report, Wolfe grunted. It was as close to praise as he got before digesting. "And the silent partner?" he asked. "Phantom," I said. "No names, no signatures, shell companies within shell companies." He frowned, tapping a finger lightly against his armrest. "No transaction occurs without a trail." "Unless," I offered, "the partner didn't want to be seen, maybe used proxies." "Possible," Wolfe admitted, though he said it like a man humoring a child. "But unlikely over a period of years without a slip." I had to agree. Secrets that big usually leaked eventually. And yet, whoever the second party was, they had been a ghost. No leaks, no lawsuits, no drunken confessions at country clubs. Wolfe brooded over his orchids and theories while I returned to my desk, feeling the familiar itch between my shoulder blades. Blackstone's silent partner was more than careful. They were buried deep for a reason. And if they were the leverage behind the blackmail, finding them was priority number one. After a few minutes of thick silence, Wolfe came to a decision. "Archie," he said, wiping his lips with surgical precision, "we require assistance." "I figured," I said. "You want the heavy artillery?" He nodded. "Engage Mr. Panzer and Mr. Durkin. Mr. Panzer is to obtain all financial trails connected to the shell company. Mr. Durkin will search building permits, contractor lists, and city council minutes." I picked up the phone. Saul Panzer was the best operative east of anywhere, and Fred Durkin, while less subtle, could dig through municipal records like a terrier on a bone. Within an hour, the troops were deployed. Saul was already charming clerks at banks with his sad sack face, and Fred was hunkering down in the dusty bowels of City Hall. Wolfe closed his eyes and resumed his communion with the orchids, content to wait while the wheels he had set in motion turned unseen. For my part, I sat back and wondered who the hell was hiding behind all that riverfront mud. The call came in just before dinner. Saul Panzer's voice, calm and precise as ever, crackled over the line. "Got a hit, Archie? Judith Pellington." "Who's she when she's home?" I asked. "Widow. Late husband was Vincent Pellington, heavy investor in real estate, big donor to political campaigns, one of Blackstone's earliest backers." "And?" I prompted. "And her name's tied to the second set of bank drafts from the shell company," Saul said, quietly tucked away but there. I whistled. "You're a prince, Saul. Anything else? She's still alive, rich, connected, and a lot more nervous lately from what I hear. I hung up, my mind already racing. A widow with political ties and a financial link to a scandal buried deep under Blackstone's shining armor. That wasn't coincidence. That was motive, opportunity, and leverage rolled into one polished package. When I relayed the news to Wolfe, he opened one eye and said, "Miss Pellington must be invited for conversation, discreetly." I smiled. Getting a wealthy widow to talk without raising alarms was a delicate art. Luckily, I had a full paint set, and it seemed our phantom partner had finally put a toe in the light. Getting in touch with Judith Pellington took the kind of finesse usually reserved for egg-balancing contests and tax audits. A simple phone call through a mutual acquaintance in real estate circles did the trick. By the next afternoon, I found myself ushered into the drawing room of her Upper East Side penthouse. Judith Pellington was the type of woman whose age could only be guessed by carbon dating, and even then she'd probably negotiate. Slim, poised, dressed in muted grey silk, she gave the impression that whatever storm might rage outside, she would remain untouched, if not untouched up. "Mr. Goodwin?" she greeted, her voice smooth enough to butter toast. "You mentioned you wished to discuss some old real estate matters." "Strictly curiosity," I said, flashing the bland smile that's gotten me into and out of more trouble than a loaded gun. Historical interest, old partnerships, forgotten deals, that sort of thing. Her eyes were calm pools. Too calm. She gestured for me to sit, then perched opposite me like a cat, pretending to nap near a mouse hole. The room smelled faintly of lavender and something sharper underneath. Nerves, maybe. I settled back, letting her do most of the talking at first. Wolfe had taught me well, let the suspect fill the silence. It's cheaper than cross-examination and often more revealing. For now, the game was politeness. Later, I suspected, it would turn into something messier. Judith tilted her head slightly, a gesture that managed to combine charm, surprise, and a touch of boredom. "I'm afraid I can't be of much assistance," she said. "Vincent handled most of our investments. Real estate was never my particular interest." I made a show of scribbling notes. "Your name did appear on some of the banking documents," I said, casually. "A technicality," she replied, dismissing it with a graceful wave of her hand. "Widows often inherit the untidiness of their late husband's dealings." Her tone was light, but her fingers toyed absently with the thin gold bracelet on her wrist. I filed that away. A small tell, but a tell nonetheless. "And Congressman Blackstone?" I asked, watching her reaction closely. She smiled, a small, perfectly calculated thing. "Leonard? We were acquaintances, of course. My husband supported his early campaigns. It was fashionable at the time." "Still in touch?" I pressed, making it sound like idle curiosity. "Not for years," she said smoothly. Our paths diverged, as they do. It was a lovely answer, clean, polished, and utterly untrustworthy. Wolfe would have called it embroidery. I called it ducking. I stayed seated, my pen moving lazily, giving her room to weave more silk into the web she was spinning. As Judith talked, I shifted gears, listening less to the words and more to the spaces between them. There were hesitations. Tiny ones, but they were there. A brief pause before mentioning her late husband. A sudden tightening around her mouth at Blackstone's name. The way she redirected the conversation to safe, dead topics whenever anything uncomfortable reared its head. Her hands were the real giveaway. She touched the bracelet, then the edge of her chair, then the pearls at her neck, as if trying to find an anchor, nervous energy poorly hidden behind an elegant mask. Wolfe would have called it an indication of internal dissonance. I called it guilt doing the jitterbug. "Of course," Judith was saying lightly. "Land deals from that long ago hardly seem relevant now, do they?" I smiled. History has a way of becoming relevant at the most inconvenient times. Her fingers froze mid-fidget before she recovered, flashing another controlled smile. She rose gracefully, signaling that the meeting was nearing its natural death. I stood too, playing the polite guest, but inside my head I was already drafting a report. Wolfe didn't need body language classes to know when someone was sitting on a powder keg. By the time I got back to the brownstone, the smell of roast duck was drifting from the kitchen, and Wolfe was in his chair, reading Goethe as if humanity's failings bored him personally. I delivered my account with professional efficiency, noting Judith's verbal dances and her unconscious tells. Wolfe listened with half-lidded eyes but sharp ears. "She dissembled," he said finally. "No question," I agreed. "She's hiding something, maybe a lot." Wolfe set his book aside. Concealment under those circumstances implies jeopardy, either to her reputation, her fortune, or her freedom. He tapped a finger against the armrest. "The land deal, Mr. Goodwin, has not yet yielded its last crop." "Great," I said. "Just when I was hoping for a quiet evening." Wolfe grunted. "Quietude is for the morally unencumbered." And with that, he closed his eyes again, dismissing me with the silent arrogance only he could make seem dignified. I don't usually snoop unless there's good reason, and Judith Pellington's sudden case of the vapors had qualified as good reason. Before leaving her penthouse while she was seeing to an urgent call from her butler, another coincidence too neat to trust, I had time to spot a scrap of torn paper poking from the wastebasket near the writing desk. A man with less flexible morals might have ignored it. Fortunately, Wolfe had cured me of such squeamishness years ago. The torn fragment was the bottom third of a letter, cream-coloured and expensive, the handwriting neat and careful. The words visible made my eyebrows dance. "Leonard. Final payment. No further delays will be tolerated." I slipped it into my pocket without a second thought. Back at the brownstone, I laid it on Wolfe's desk like a sacrificial offering. He stared at it for a long moment, then said, "Judith Pellington, it seems, was negotiating under duress." "And Leonard Blackstone," I added grimly, "wasn't just a passive victim." Wolfe's lips twitched, a rare movement that meant either trouble or triumph, possibly both. The web wasn't just tangled, it was tightening, and it was beginning to strangle. I was halfway through a ham sandwich and a bad newspaper editorial when the call came. Fritz answered it, but I could hear the change in his voice from the dining room. Fritz didn't rattle easily, which meant trouble had punched its ticket. He appeared a moment later, pale around the edges. "Mr. Goodwin, a call from Detective Rowcliffe." I took it in Wolfe's office, where Wolfe, blessedly ignorant for the moment, was nurturing his orchids. Rowcliffe got right to it. "Judith Pellington's dead." That got my attention. "How?" "Apparent suicide, penthouse apartment, overdose, neat as a pin." I didn't buy it for a nickel, but I kept my voice bland. "When?" "Discovered about an hour ago. Maid found her. Place was locked from the inside." "Anyone else poking around?" "Some of the boys from homicide, but it's unofficial. Suicide, Goodwin, not homicide." "Sure," I said, making it sound like gospel. "Thanks." I hung up and turned to find Wolfe standing in the doorway. He didn't ask questions. Wolfe had a way of absorbing news without needing the messy transfer of words. "Judith Pellington," I said. "Dead, officially a suicide." Wolfe's jaw set in a grim line. He said only, "Go," meaning, "Go look, go see, go prove." I was already reaching for my hat when he added, "You will find incongruities, Mr. Goodwin. Attend to them." There was no doubt in his voice, and none in my step as I headed out. It's amazing what a press badge and a knowing nod can get you, especially when the right palms have been greased higher up the food chain. Inside Judith Pellington's penthouse, the air was thick with the polite disinterest of cops who had been told they were dealing with a non-issue. I did my best imitation of a weary journalist sniffing for an angle. The patrolman at the door barely glanced at me. Judith's body was still sprawled on the chaise longue, covered respectfully. A silver tray on the side table displayed a tidy arrangement, a decanter of brandy, a half-filled glass, and an open prescription bottle artfully tipped over. It was textbook. Too textbook. I moved casually around the room, observing. No signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no scattered papers, just a neat, silent stage set for death. One of the detectives yawned as he jotted notes. "Overdose," he muttered. "Classic case. Left the door bolted from the inside. No foul play." I nodded agreeably but made my own inventory. The windows were latched, the secondary exits locked from within. The scene wanted you to see only what it offered, and Wolfe had taught me early that scenes that offered too little were as suspicious as scenes that screamed too much. I kept my observations quiet, but my mind was hammering at the walls. Judith hadn't planned this tableau. Someone had planned it for her, and whoever it was knew exactly what they were doing. I circled back toward the chaise, careful not to draw attention. The tech boys hadn't moved the body yet, but I caught a glimpse beneath the throw draped over Judith's arms. There, a purplish smear on her wrist, half concealed by the cuff of her blouse, bruising. I felt a slow, cold anger knot in my gut. Overdoses didn't cause bruising like that. Struggle did. Pressure applied by human hands did. My eye caught another detail. No suicide note. A woman like Judith, composed, socially trained, to handle appearances, would have left something. A scrap of explanation, if only to preserve her dignity. Nothing. The final kicker was the locked room setup. Neat as a surgeon's stitch, yes, but mechanical latches can be manipulated. I knew a dozen ways to stage a lock from outside. So did half the professional criminals in the city, and anyone desperate enough. I left the scene with my stomach tight and my brain hotter than July asphalt. Rowcliffe was already preparing his report, filing it under closed in his mind. They could call it suicide all they wanted. I had seen enough locked rooms, enough cleaned-up corpses to know better. By the time I hit the street, I was already rehearsing how I would tell Wolfe. Because Wolfe, once set on the scent of murder, was not a man to be deterred by locked doors, lazy detectives, or polite political hush-ups. Wolfe was back in his chair when I returned, a bottle of beer resting untouched on the stand beside him. He didn't open his eyes as I reported, but the slight tension in his broad frame betrayed that he missed nothing. When I finished, he said only, "Bruising?" "Clear as a black eye," I confirmed. "And no note?" "Not a scrap." He grunted. "Of course not. She did not intend to die." For a moment there was a silence thicker than the brownstone's heavy drapes. Wolfe stared at the ceiling, and something flickered behind those lidded eyes. Something like guilt, or its colder cousin, responsibility. But it was gone as quickly as it came. "I should have moved faster," he said, almost to himself. "You didn't kill her?" I said quietly. "No," Wolfe agreed. "But we stirred the water, and the fish fled deeper." His voice was measured, but the set of his mouth was grim. For Wolfe, this was more than a puzzle now. It was a personal affront, and a debt he intended to settle. And when Wolfe decided a matter was personal, there wasn't a man alive who could make him let go. He sat forward, planting his massive hands on the chair arms. "This was no suicide," Wolfe said. "It was murder, deliberate, calculated, and well executed." "No argument here," I said. He eyed me. "Mr. Goodwin, the official verdict will not be altered unless incontrovertible evidence is produced." "Which," I said, "we're short on." "Temporarily," Wolfe said, a faint glint igniting in his eyes. I knew that look. It was the look of a man assembling pieces in his head faster than a dozen stenographers could type them. It meant he already saw the outline of the solution and was now merely deciding where to apply the pressure first. "You will proceed methodically," he instructed. "Discreet inquiries, a re-examination of Miss Pellington's financials, her social movements, her associates." "And Blackstone?" I asked. Wolfe's mouth twitched, a gesture that, on anyone else, would have been a grin. "Mr. Blackstone," he said softly, "may find the walls narrowing around him sooner than he anticipates." I rose, already feeling the familiar prickle of coming trouble up my spine. As I reached the door, Wolfe added, "Attend carefully, Mr. Goodwin. Our adversaries are clever." I nodded. Clever, maybe. But they weren't Wolfe. And they weren't ready for what was coming. The first sign of the coming storm was the doorbell's angry buzz. Fritz answered, but the gruff voice that barreled past him needed no introduction. Inspector Kramer, face redder than a Christmas roast, stomped into the office without waiting for permission. His battered hat was clutched in one hand like a weapon that he was half tempted to use. "Wolfe!" he barked. Wolfe, serenely unmoved, remained seated behind his desk, his fingers lightly drumming the armrests. I stayed put on the red leather chair, mentally counting the seconds it would take for the room's temperature to drop back to tolerable. "Inspector," Wolfe said smoothly, "how pleasant to see you, though I assume your visit is not purely social." Kramer's nostrils flared. "Pleasant isn't the word I'd use. What the devil are you meddling in now?" "An engagement, Inspector," Wolfe said calmly. "My professional prerogative. You had contact with Judith Pellington before she died. That makes you part of the mess." "An inference, not a fact," Wolfe corrected, his tone glacial. Kramer's glare could have peeled paint. "This isn't some two-bit robbery. It's a politically sensitive death, and I don't need you stirring the pot." Wolfe smiled faintly. "You have already stirred it yourself, Inspector. You merely dislike the aroma." Kramer planted himself squarely in front of Wolfe's desk, looming like a man prepared to shout his way to satisfaction. Wolfe, never one for theatrics unless orchids were involved, merely lifted an eyebrow. "You're hiding something," Kramer accused. "I can smell it." Wolfe gave a mild shrug. "You overestimate both your olfactory prowess and my inclination to withhold." "Don't get cute," Kramer growled. "You always know more than you say. You start sniffing around. People end up dead." "An unfortunate correlation, not a causation," Wolfe said dryly. I sat back, enjoying the show. Kramer and Wolfe battling was better than most prize fights and involved fewer broken noses, though not always fewer casualties. "You think Judith Pellington was murdered," Kramer said bluntly. "I think," Wolfe said, "that suicide is a convenient conclusion, but not an inevitable one." Kramer scowled, working it over in his mind. He wanted to accuse Wolfe of obstruction, but he knew, as we all did, that Wolfe would dance through any charge with the agility of a cat avoiding a puddle. "I won't have you muddying the waters," he snapped. "The waters, Inspector," Wolfe murmured, "are already irreparably sullied. I merely intend to clarify their depth." And he left it there, bait dangling. Kramer narrowed his eyes, the way a man does when he knows he's being played but can't quite see the strings. "You're poking at something," he said. "What?" Wolfe leaned back, lacing his fingers across his considerable girth. "Only at the evident inconsistencies." "Such as?" "No suicide note, bruising inconsistent with self-inflicted injury, a conveniently locked door." Kramer grunted. "You think someone staged it?" "I think," Wolfe said, "that the surface appearance of events may conceal a deeper reality." It was the most Wolfe would ever offer without being pinned to the mat. Kramer stared hard. "You've got a theory." "Of course," Wolfe said blandly. "But theories, Inspector, are a dime a dozen. Proof is what matters." I watched Kramer wrestle with it. He wanted Wolfe's cards, but Wolfe wasn't even admitting he held a deck. "And if there was proof," Kramer said slowly, "it could be inconvenient." Wolfe permitted himself a small, non-committal smile. "You always dance around the fire," Kramer said bitterly. "One day you'll fall in." "I am singularly flame retardant," Wolfe replied. Kramer grunted again, frustration radiating off him like heat from a stove, but he hadn't gotten what he came for, and Wolfe wasn't about to offer it. Finally, Kramer jammed his hat back on his head and gave Wolfe a look that could have curdled paint. "I'll say this much," he muttered. "There are holes in that suicide story big enough to drive a truck through." A gratifying concession, Wolfe said, not bothering to disguise the satisfaction in his voice. But it won't matter, Kramer went on. Downtown wants it closed, quietly. They don't want the media digging into a congressman's old friends and dirty laundry. Pragmatism over justice, Wolfe said, almost sadly. It's politics, Kramer snapped. You think I like it? Wolfe inclined his head. I think, Inspector, that you dislike it intensely. Kramer stared at him a moment longer, then shook his head in disgust. If you dig something up, Goodwin better bring it to me first. Naturally, Wolfe said smoothly. Kramer snorted and stomped out, leaving behind the faint scent of tobacco, anger, and frustration. I glanced at Wolfe. You going too? Bring it to him? Wolfe said. In due course, after all. And here he allowed the barest flicker of a smile. Inspector Kramer will be most useful, even if only to show us which roads are barricaded. And just like that, the war officially began. The call came at 9 sharp, which for Saul Panzer was practically a raucous disturbance. Saul didn't waste time on preambles. It's not Judith Pellington, he said, without so much as a good morning. It was Vincent. I perched the phone between shoulder and ear. Vincent Pellington, the dearly departed? The same. He was the real money behind the riverfront deal, used Judith's name on some of the paperwork to keep his hands clean. Chivalrous, I said. Saul ignored it. Bank records confirm it. The funds traced back to Vincent's private accounts. Judith inherited everything after his death, including the liabilities. And the connection to Blackstone? Solid. Vincent and Blackstone co-owned the shell company that bought the riverfront property. Blackstone made himself scarce once rezoning inquiries started heating up. I whistled low under my breath. So Blackstone's hands aren't just dirty, they're soaked. Looks that way, Saul said, and someone found out? I thanked him and hung up, already spinning it through my mind. Judith had been the convenient public face for private sins. Sins that Blackstone had every reason to keep buried, especially with a career built on sermons about transparency and honor. When I relayed it to Wolfe, his reaction was a slight widening of the eyes, practically a standing ovation by his standards. The past, Mr. Goodwin, Wolfe murmured, is seldom as distant as men pretend. And in this case it was very much alive and vengeful. Over lunch, squab in truffle sauce for Wolfe, ham on rye for me. We unravelled the threads Saul had pulled. Judith Pellington, gracious hostess and widow, had inherited more than a fortune. She had inherited the dirty secrets wrapped in that fortune. She had carried the burden without public scandal for years, either out of loyalty to her late husband or a sharp instinct for self-preservation. The profits from the riverfront property had been generous, but tied like an anchor to old, questionable deals that could sink reputations overnight if exposed. Worse, with Vincent gone, Judith had become the sole repository of knowledge and the sole potential scapegoat if anyone decided to dig. She was a liability to Blackstone, Wolfe said thoughtfully, dabbing at his mouth with a napkin. More than that, I said. She was a loaded gun just waiting for someone to pull the trigger. Wolfe gave a nod. And someone has... The logic was tightening like a noose. Judith, aware of the increasing blackmail pressure, had grown desperate. Blackstone, needing to secure his future, might have concluded there was only one way to guarantee her silence. And the clock, as they say, had run out, fatally. After lunch, Wolfe dispatched me to the office library where Saul's research dossier awaited. The more I read, the more it stank. Blackstone hadn't merely distanced himself from the riverfront deal. He had orchestrated elaborate legal maneuvers to shield himself. Secret side agreements, concealed payments routed through third parties, asset transfers masked under legitimate charities, all crafted to make sure that when the light finally hit the mess, Blackstone's name would stay conveniently in the shade. The documents hinted at the ruthless intelligence behind Blackstone's polished image. He hadn't just been lucky. He had been thorough, but thoroughness had its cost. It meant there were witnesses, records, people who had helped stitch the tapestry and could now pull the threads loose if cornered. Judith had been one such person. and now her death looked less like a tragedy and more like a strategic operation. Neat, efficient, with plausible deniability wrapped in a shroud of apparent despair. When I laid the documents on Wolfe's desk, he examined them with grim satisfaction. "Blackstone," he said, "is not merely culpable. He is architect and engineer. And architects," he added dryly, "dislike when the scaffolding collapses." The scaffolding, I thought, was starting to sway badly. If Blackstone had cracks in his facade, I figured someone close to him might have seen the plaster peeling. Enter Alan Purvis, a former aide, recently separated from Blackstone's employ under circumstances as murky as a swamp. I found him nursing a beer in a dim tavern near the courthouse, looking like he'd slept in his suit, and lost the argument. "Blackstone?" he said when I dropped the name. "He's a saint in public and a shark in private." "And Judith Pellington?" I asked. He snorted. "She knew too much. They all did. The land deals, the rezoning. Everybody kept quiet because they had too much to lose." "Blackmail?" I pressed. Purvis hesitated. "Rumors. People whispered about someone squeezing Blackstone. Money changing hands." "And did he pay?" Purvis hesitated again, then gave a bitter laugh. "He didn't get where he is by paying." No, I thought. He got there by eliminating obstacles, one way or another. I bought Purvis another beer and left him to his regrets. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe listened without comment, his eyes half closed. But when I finished, he murmured, "Blackstone has a past he would kill to protect." And it was starting to look like he had. As I organized my notes later that night, the pieces fell together with a soft but chilling click. What if Blackstone hadn't simply been a target of blackmail? What if he had engineered the blackmail himself? A maneuver to flush out Judith's intentions, to gauge her loyalty, to corner her before she cornered him? Wolfe, predictably, was already 2 steps ahead. When I broached the theory, he merely nodded. Blackstone's strategy would be logical, he said. A desperate man acts preemptively. He initiates the deception he fears. And when it backfired, I asked, he concluded the situation required a permanent resolution. A grim silence settled over the office. The blackmailer, the murder, the tangled history. It was all orbiting around Blackstone like flies around a corpse. The difference was this corpse still walked, talked, and legislated. But not for long. Not if Wolfe had anything to say about it. By Wolfe's orders, I placed a discreet call to a trusted friend over at the Gazette, a man who knew how to stir mud without getting any on his own shoes. By sunset, a whisper had begun to slip through certain corners of the press corps. Undisclosed evidence had surfaced regarding Judith Pellington's suicide, evidence that might demand a fresh investigation. It wasn't much, just a suggestion, a rumor dangling without confirmation, but it didn't need to be solid to get the right people sweating. The bait was set. By the next morning, I counted 3 separate tails shadowing me as I ran errands. They weren't police. Too impatient, too obvious. They were private muscle, hired in a hurry and worried about what might come to light. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe sat comfortably, reading Tacitus with the casual serenity of a man already predicting every move the opposition would make. "Expect tremors," he said, without looking up. "I'm counting on earthquakes," I said. "Good," Wolfe murmured. "Then we shall excavate buried truths." It wasn't just about rattling cages. It was about setting a stage so perfectly that when the guilty parties arrived, they would be cornered before they realized the trap had already sprung around them, and judging by the sudden flurry of nervous phone calls, our prey was stirring, exactly as Wolfe intended. The next move came wrapped in Wolfe's finest stationery and phrased with all the weight of an imperial decree. I personally delivered the invitations, summons really, to the 4 principals. Congressman Leonard Blackstone, Alan Purvis, the ex-aide, Carlton Ames, the Pellington's slippery lawyer, and Lillian Frost, Judith's former housekeeper. Each was invited to the brownstone for what was delicately termed a review of evidence relevant to recent events. No explanation, no room for negotiation. The reactions varied. Blackstone received his with a cold smile that didn't touch his eyes. Purvis looked like he might throw up in the nearest trash can. Ames clucked and fussed, trying to wheedle details out of me and failing. And Lillian Frost. Lillian froze, her hand trembling just a fraction as she took the envelope. When I reported back, Wolfe nodded, unsurprised. The guilty dread uncertainty above all else, he said. That evening, Wolfe had Fritz set the office precisely. The globe shifted a half-inch, chairs arranged at mathematical angles, the room subtly transformed into a courtroom awaiting judgment. Saul Panzer and Fred Durkin lingered unobtrusively nearby, ready if anyone decided to make a bolt for freedom. Not that they would get far. When the trap closed, Wolfe intended it to be absolute. At precisely 8 o'clock, the first of the guests arrived. They trickled in, each one carrying invisible burdens heavier than any briefcase. Blackstone was cool, practiced, the perfect image of a man with nothing to hide and too much to lose. Purvis was twitchy, eyes darting like a rat trapped in a maze. Ames blustered, all false joviality and sweaty palms. Lillian Frost moved like a ghost, silent and strained. Wolfe welcomed them with a nod, said almost nothing, and allowed the room to ferment in its own stew of anxiety. It worked. By the time everyone was seated, the silence was oppressive. Even the ticking of the old wall clock seemed accusatory. Wolfe sat with his hands steepled, his gaze half-lidded, exerting more pressure by saying nothing than most men could by shouting. Finally, he spoke. "I have assembled you," Wolfe said, his voice as cool as the ice in Fritz's best punch, "because truths have been withheld and lies have been told." No one moved. "No one will leave," Wolfe continued, "until the matter is resolved to my satisfaction." I watched the reactions. Purvis swallowed convulsively. Ames clutched his briefcase like a life-preserver. Lillian's hands twisted in her lap. And Blackstone? Blackstone smiled, but it was the tight, brittle smile of a man gripping a crumbling ledge. The atmosphere was charged, volatile. All it needed was one spark to ignite. The spark came faster than expected. Wolfe, still seated, began to methodically dismantle the facade piece by piece. He recounted the riverfront deal, the shell companies, the silent partner. Each word was a chisel tap against the brittle wall of secrets. He didn't accuse, he described, and it was devastating. When Wolfe spoke of Judith Pellington's final days, her fear, her pressure, her isolation, Lillian Frost visibly flinched. Her fingers dug into the armrest of her chair, as if trying to claw her way out of the room. Wolfe turned his gaze on her, steady and relentless. "There are those among us," he said softly, "who benefited from silence, who traded knowledge for security. But silence, when broken, demands a price." Lillian's breathing grew ragged. Sweat beaded at her temples. When Wolfe mentioned the payments, small, regular, untraceable to the casual observer, Lillian snapped. With a choked cry, she sprang to her feet, knocking the chair backward. "I didn't mean to," she gasped. "I just wanted what was owed. I didn't." She bolted for the door. Saul Panzer and Fred Durkin, alert and ready, intercepted her before she made it 3 steps. The room exploded into motion, Blackstone half rising, Purvis gaping, Ames babbling about legal representation. But it was too late. The housekeeper had cracked the dam, and the flood was coming. Fred and Saul efficiently guided Lillian back to her chair, none too gently. Her face was pale, her hands shaking. Wolfe inclined his head gravely. "Thank you, gentlemen." He turned back to the assembled group, his voice now cutting with surgical precision. "Lillian Frost," he said, "accepted payments to remain silent about the land deals, and about other matters best left buried." Lillian whimpered, but said nothing. "However," Wolfe continued, "her extortion, though criminal, was not murderous." All eyes, including Lillian's tear-brimmed ones, swung to Blackstone. Wolfe allowed the silence to thicken until it was unbearable. "One among you," Wolfe said, his voice soft but lethal, sought to erase a liability by erasing a life. Blackstone's jaw tightened visibly. He was trapped, cornered, and Wolfe, as always, had left no exit. The next step would be the final revelation, and this time, even Blackstone's polished charm would not save him. The office, at Wolfe's insistence, had been reset to its full, judicial glory. The heavy air seemed thicker than usual, the lamplight harsher, the shadows deeper. Blackstone sat stiffly on the red leather chair, the embodiment of outraged dignity barely holding together. Purvis sweated through his collar. Ames shifted constantly, fingers drumming an erratic rhythm on his knee. Lillian Frost sat shrunken and defeated, her eyes darting toward the door whenever she thought no one noticed. Wolfe surveyed them all from behind his desk like a magistrate preparing to pass sentence. When he finally spoke, it was in a tone of almost conversational mildness, which made it all the more devastating. "Lies," Wolfe said, "lies told in haste, lies maintained through fear, lies leading inexorably to death." No one answered. "I have allowed you to stew," Wolfe continued. "Now you shall understand why." He gestured to a slim sheaf of papers on his desk, a weapon more dangerous in his hands than any firearm. "You may believe the web you wove sufficient to shield you. You are mistaken. A crime has been committed, and it has been unraveled thread by thread." He paused, allowing the silence to build, until the tension vibrated like a plucked wire. "Tonight," he said, "truth will find you." I didn't move. None of us did. Wolfe's tone was too final, too certain. He wasn't hunting anymore. He was preparing to strike. Wolfe shifted his considerable bulk slightly, a subtle signal that the real performance had begun. "We shall begin," he said, "with Miss Lillian Frost." The housekeeper flinched visibly, her hands knotting into white fists on her lap. "You, Miss Frost," Wolfe said, "entered into an arrangement with Judith Pellington shortly after Vincent Pellington's death. An arrangement involving silence. For a price." Lillian opened her mouth, then closed it again. "The payments were modest," Wolfe continued. "Deliberately so. Small enough not to raise suspicion, frequent enough to ensure continued dependency." He tapped the papers. "Here, documented, are bank transfers originating from an anonymous holding account controlled indirectly by Judith Pellington." Lillian sagged in her chair, beaten. "You were not," Wolfe said sharply, "an agent of evil. You were a scavenger, profiting from secrets that were not yours to expose." Ames made a small noise, perhaps of protest, but a single glance from Wolfe silenced him. "You saw an opportunity," Wolfe said to Lillian, "and you took it. You became a parasite on a decaying corpse of corruption." Lillian wept silently, but Wolfe pressed on, unsparing. "And it was your renewed demands," he said, "escalated as your desperation grew, that set in motion a chain of events far graver than you intended." He let that hang. "You began with theft," Wolfe said. "You ended, unwittingly, by lighting the fuse to murder." The first piece of the puzzle had been placed, and the others were ready to fall. Wolfe's eyes, heavy-lidded but razor-sharp, shifted from Lillian to the others. "Judith Pellington," he said, "was no innocent. She inherited not merely property, but knowledge. Knowledge that could destroy reputations, including her own." Blackstone sat like a statue, but his jaw was tight, his fingers twitching against the armrests. "When Miss Frost's renewed blackmail demands reached her," Wolfe continued, "Judith understood that silence could no longer protect her." His voice hardened. She approached an attorney, drafted documents, began gathering evidence. Carlton Ames made a strangled sound. Wolfe ignored him. "She intended," Wolfe said, "to expose the full extent of the riverfront conspiracy and thereby absolve herself, whatever the cost, to others." He allowed the words to settle. "That knowledge," Wolfe said, turning his gaze full upon Blackstone, "was lethal." No one spoke. The room was frozen, except for the ticking clock and the steady drip of tension. "Judith's threat," Wolfe said, ignited the desperation of those who feared exposure, those who understood that reputation, power, and wealth would not survive the coming revelation. Wolfe's voice lowered, forcing everyone to lean in slightly. Thus fear, he said, became motive. Fear of disgrace, fear of ruin, fear of justice. He leaned back, folding his hands, and fear, he concluded, leads inevitably to desperate acts. Blackstone's knuckles whitened, and Wolfe, relentless, moved in for the kill. "You, Mr. Blackstone," Wolfe said, his voice now precise as a scalpel, "had the most to lose." Blackstone's mask held for a moment longer before beginning to crack. "You feared," Wolfe said, "that Judith's revelations would not merely end your political career, but expose financial improprieties sufficient to warrant prosecution." He gestured toward the assembled papers. Her letter drafts, her meeting appointments, even the partial financial records she had begun to amass, all point to imminent disclosure. Blackstone said nothing. His silence was louder than a scream. "You knew," Wolfe pressed, "that you could not afford a scandal. You could not allow her to speak." He paused, then continued coldly. "And so you acted. In the days preceding her death, you increased pressure, both direct and indirect, surveillance, anonymous warnings, hired agents to unsettle her. But Judith remained resolute." He tapped his fingers once on the desk. "Thus, on the night in question, you visited her penthouse under the guise of reconciliation." The others shifted, but Wolfe ignored them. "You brought with you a sedative, one capable of inducing unconsciousness rapidly. You ensured the maid would be absent. A telephone call sent her on an errand. You administered the drug, perhaps in brandy, perhaps under pretext. When Judith was incapacitated, you bruised her wrists, dragging her limp form to the chaise." Ames made a choking noise. Purvis stared, frozen. "You staged the scene, the tipped bottle, the scattered pills, the locked doors, and departed using a pre-rigged mechanism to latch the door from outside." His voice dropped. "You murdered her, Mr. Blackstone, not in passion, but with cold, precise calculation." The silence was unbearable. Only then did Wolfe say, almost casually, "You then sought to frame Miss Frost, counting on her previous guilt to shield you from inquiry. And," he concluded, "you would have succeeded." He let that hang, a blade suspended over the room. "But," Wolfe said, "you miscalculated." And now Blackstone's world, so carefully built, was crumbling around him. Wolfe adjusted himself slightly in his chair, his voice now purely instructional, as if lecturing a particularly dense class. "You erred," he said, "in 3 critical respects. First," Wolfe said, raising a finger, "the timing. The medical examiner's initial report noted that the level of sedatives in Judith's bloodstream was inconsistent with self-administration. She would have lost consciousness too quickly to stage the scene herself. Second," he continued, "the financial trail. Miss Frost's blackmail payments ceased abruptly 2 weeks prior to Judith's death, suggesting a severed negotiation, not an ongoing extortion. And third," Wolfe said, his voice ablaze, "your own behavior." Blackstone stiffened, but Wolfe pressed inexorably forward. "Your initial visit to my office was laced with fear. Not the fear of exposure by another, but fear that someone would unearth the truth you had buried. You cast furtive glances at the street, afraid of being followed, of being seen. Not by a blackmailer, Mr. Blackstone, but by the aftermath of your own act." Blackstone's hands were clenched into white fists on his knees. "You attempted," Wolfe said, "to control the narrative, to engage me to find a fictitious blackmailer, to misdirect and diffuse any investigation. But," Wolfe said, leaning forward, "you cannot misdirect a mind that refuses to be led astray." There was no response from Blackstone, only silence. And Wolfe, ruthlessly efficient, drove the final nail. "You are," he said, "guilty of murder." And there, laid bare, was the undeniable truth. Wolfe sat back, his face solemn. "There is," he said softly, No greater tragedy than ambition untempered by conscience. He turned his gaze toward Blackstone, not with anger, but with weary disdain. You rose, Mr. Blackstone, not by virtue, but by careful deception. You masked your greed with rhetoric, your corruption with charm. He paused. And when the structure you built on lies began to tremble, you did not seek redemption. You sought eradication of the threat. There was a melancholy weight to his words now, a recognition of human frailty as much as human evil. You might have confessed, Wolfe said. You might have faced your reckoning with dignity. He gestured toward Lillian Frost, hunched and broken. Toward Ames, pale and sweating. Toward Purvis, a silent wreck. Instead, you dragged others into your spiral. You chose betrayal. You chose death. His voice dropped further. Ambition, Wolfe said, is not evil, but ambition unfettered by honor is rot, spreading, consuming, devouring, until nothing remains but a hollow shell. He let the words settle, heavy as stone. Then almost quietly, he finished. And so you have become your own ruin. The room remained still. And Wolfe, having said all that needed saying, waited. The sharp sound of a throat-clearing broke the silence. From the anteroom, Inspector Kramer stepped forward, arms crossed, eyes hard. I heard enough, he said grimly. Blackstone didn't move. Perhaps he couldn't. Kramer advanced, slipping a pair of handcuffs from his coat pocket. Leonard Blackstone, he said, his voice low and certain. You are under arrest for the murder of Judith Pellington. Still no protest, no dramatic collapse, only a hollow resignation. Fred Durkin and Saul Panzer closed in quietly to assist. Kramer glanced at Wolfe, and something passed between them. Not gratitude, exactly, but acknowledgement. Justice, long delayed, was finally in motion. As they led Blackstone away, the room seemed to exhale. The tension that had bound us all loosened. Wolfe leaned back, closed his eyes briefly, and said nothing. For my part, I watched Blackstone go, feeling the strange, sour taste of justice served too late. When the door closed behind them, Wolfe opened his eyes. Beer, Mr. Goodwin, he said simply, and somehow, in the quiet aftermath, that was the most fitting conclusion of all. The morning papers wasted no ink on subtlety. Blackstone arrested, read one headline, thick enough to trip over. Fall from grace, said another, underneath a grainy photo of Leonard Blackstone being led, cuffs discreetly hidden but not invisible, down the courthouse steps. The political world, predictably, reacted like a kicked hornet's nest. Allies fled, enemies sharpened knives, editorials praised the system's integrity while bemoaning its failures. Through it all, Wolfe remained impervious. I fielded the phone calls, reporters, politicians, even a few panicked society matrons, desperate to know whether their past bridge games with Judith Pellington would be called into question. I stonewalled them all with the efficiency of a brick wall. Blackstone, once a rising star destined for higher office, had plummeted in record time. The charges, conspiracy, fraud, and murder, meant his days in the public eye were numbered. The irony didn't escape me. He had spent years crafting the perfect image, only to watch it collapse overnight because of secrets he thought buried too deep to touch him. As I stacked the morning papers neatly on Wolfe's desk, I thought, if ambition built castles, fear furnished their dungeons, and Blackstone had locked himself in his own. After the dust settled, Wolfe retreated in the grand tradition of defeated Roman generals, with dignity, stubbornness, and an orchid room instead of a battlefield. He declared a moratorium on accepting new cases, waving off even the most lucrative offers with a dismissive grunt. The brownstone became a fortress again, no visitors unless bearing groceries, beer, or emergency horticultural supplies. Fame, Wolfe said one evening, from behind a potted dendrobium, is an affliction worse than influenza. Especially when it comes with subpoenas, I said. He glared at me, but didn't bother rebutting the point. Every morning, Fritz carried breakfast trays up to the plant rooms. Every afternoon, Wolfe wrote meticulous notes about bloom cycles and fertilizer formulas. Every evening, I read the newspapers aloud until Wolfe waved a hand for silence. It was his way of washing off the stink of public scandal without letting it infect his private world. And I didn't blame him. Cases like this, full of lies, ambition, betrayal, and murder, tended to leave more grime on the soul than even Wolfe's sizable intellect cared to tolerate. The world outside kept turning, churning up new scandals. Inside the brownstone, though, for a blessed week, everything stayed still. When you work for Wolfe long enough, you develop a certain cynicism about human nature. Call it a job hazard. Blackstone had worn a mask better than most, a champion of transparency, a paragon of public virtue, all the while hiding rot so deep it took a murder to expose it. He hadn't just lied to voters or colleagues, he'd lied to himself. That was the thing about masks. Wear them too long and you forget you're wearing one. Sitting at my desk, feet up, flipping idly through a week-old Gazette, I let the thought turn over. Everyone wore a mask. Some were thin, easy to peel off after cocktail parties or board meetings. Others had grown so thick they'd fused with the bone underneath. The trouble came when reality caught up, when the seams cracked and the truth leaked out for everyone to see. And it always leaked, eventually. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but sooner or later, every mask crumbled. Wolfe, with his orchids and his beer and his maddening precision, understood that better than anyone. And me? I just made sure to keep my own mask simple and easy to drop when necessary. So far, it had worked. By Friday evening, Saul Panzer and Fred Durkin wandered by, lured by the promise of cold beer and a night without homicide on the agenda. We gathered in the office, feet up, bottles sweating on coasters, the air heavy with the comfortable silence of men who'd survived another brush with other people's greed. Fred raised his bottle in a mock toast. "To silent partners," he said. "And noisier ones," Saul added dryly. I grinned. "In politics, crime, and real estate." "Same difference," Fred said, and we clinked bottles. Even Wolfe deigned to sip from his glass, though he would never admit to joining in anything so crass as a toast. The conversation drifted, full of knowing jabs and wry observations about the unseen hands pulling strings behind grand reputations. By the third round, we were laughing more than we ought to have been, given the week we'd just survived. But laughter, like orchids and good beer, had a way of making the stains of other people's sins a little easier to scrub off. When the clock chimed 10, Saul and Fred said their goodbyes. Wolfe grunted his approval of their departure, and I sat back, finished my beer, and thought, not a bad ending, all things considered. Not bad at all. As Nero Wolfe set down his glass, his gaze rested thoughtfully on the orchids glowing softly beneath the lamplight. "Ambition," he mused aloud, "can drive a man to greatness, but unchecked, it devours everything, even its master." Blackstone forgot that masks crafted from deceit rarely survive the harsh light of truth. He turned slightly, eyes sharp. "Tell me, dear listener, at what precise moment do you believe Blackstone sealed his own fate? What was his greatest mistake? If you've enjoyed unraveling this mystery with us, consider subscribing for more Nero Wolfe cases, and please share your insights below and pass this story along to your friends and family who relish mysteries of the human heart as much as we do.